I'm Sephora Berman, the chair for the initiative. I'm speaking to you from the unceded territories of the Tsleil-Waututh, the Squamish, and the Musqueam First Nations here in Vancouver, Canada. This event is being recorded, and live Spanish translation is available, courtesy of our translator, Pamela. Please click on the globe icon on your screen, at the bottom of your screen, to access the translation. Choose the language you'd like to hear in. This June, the world's environment ministers will meet at Stockholm+50 to commemorate 50 years since the first international UN summit on the environment. In those 50 years, there have been significant moments of international cooperation to manage threats to our planet, from a nuclear ban treaty, to global cooperation to save the ozone, to earlier this year when the UN decided to create the world's first global plastics treaty. Yet governments have failed to address the top threat to our climate, biodiversity, human health, and water: fossil fuels. Fossil fuels are responsible for 86% of the CO2 emissions that have caused climate change over the past decade. On Wednesday, Ontario Guterres responded to the World Meteorological Organization's latest State of the Climate report, saying, "We must end fossil fuel pollution and accelerate the renewable energy transition before we incinerate our only home." Fossil fuels aren't only a risk to our climate. They fuel wars, including the current war in the Ukraine. They threaten biodiversity, increase corruption, and harm our health, causing 1 in 5 deaths globally. They also threaten every single sustainable development goal, the main focus of Stockholm+50. They're a massive threat to a healthy and prosperous future. Despite this, countries plan to produce more than double the fossil fuels by 2030 than is consistent with the Paris Agreement goals. And while the Paris Agreement is a historic international climate mechanism, it doesn't even mention coal, oil, or gas once, and must be complemented by a specific treaty focused on managing a just transition away from fossil fuels. The Fossil Fuel Treaty campaign tries to address the lack of global governance and mechanisms for managing the transition away from fossil fuels. The treaty proposal is not only to make the transition away from fossil fuels faster, but also fairer. That is to say, where wealthier countries with the capacity to transition first move fastest, giving more time and support to nations with less capacity or have done less historically to cause climate change. 2022 must be the year that governments in the international system stop their blah, blah, blah and respond urgently to the need to address the fossil fuel production by creating the missing framework inside the UN climate governance space, so that the wind down of fossil fuels happens with wealthy producing countries such as the US, Norway, the UK, Australia, my own country, Canada, acting first. This is why the Treaty Network and its allies aim to make this commemorative summit an opportunity to build significant diplomatic support for tackling fossil fuel supply. To dig into this deeper, we have a great panel of speakers today, including Rebecca Burns, who's the Deputy Director of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative. Rebecca also leads on the initiative's research strategy and global registry of fossil fuels. She previously worked in energy and just transition policy at the Grantham Research Institute and the NSW government. Rebecca has provided legal, strategic, and policy advice to the least developed countries group within the climate negotiations since 2015. We also have Andreas Tapia, head of communications at Confanaye. Andreas has been head of communications at the Confederation of Indigenous Nationalities of the Ecuadorian Amazon since 2016. He has a master's degree in biological sciences from the Central University of Ecuador. He's the author of several scientific articles and journalistic columns in national and international media. Also joining us is Simon Holmstrom from the Nordic Council. Simon is an environmental activist, currently the youngest member of parliament in Åland. He represents a new Ålandic party, which is now part of the regional government. Simon has a master's degree in environmental psychology from Surrey University and has since then taken a leading role in the Ålandic sustainability work. He is engaged in the Nordic Council and his center group and is spearheading the Nordic Climate Alliance, an initiative formed from the Nordic Council on the production of fossil fuels. And finally, we have Magdalena Madi from the Stockholm+50 Youth Task Force. Magdalena is from Zenkon Kataf local government area of Kudani State, Nigeria. She's involved in Theatre for Development, where dramatic performances are used as vehicles for developmental actions. Magdalena is the Director of Development and Advancement, American Football for African Mission, and a member of the Stockholm+50 Youth Task Force. She's an environmental activist who strives for a sustainable and prosperous future for all. Rebecca, let me turn to you first. Could you elaborate on how this new UN summit is a key step in international climate governance, what is at stake, and the treaty's impact strategy to achieve it?
Sure. Thank you so much, Sephora, and thanks everyone. So as Sephora mentioned, Stockholm+50 is a global UN conference that is designed to commemorate the first UN conference on the environment that happened in Stockholm 50 years ago. And that conference is widely considered to be the birthplace of modern environmental multilateralism. Stockholm+50 is unique because it isn't meeting about any particular environmental agreement, but rather it is a global stock-taking process that's looking at the whole spectrum of global efforts to address environmental challenges over the past 50 years. And of course, this is incredibly important because it's clear that 50 years on from the original Stockholm conference, the world is both in an ecological and a climate crisis. The latest State of the Climate report shows us that 2021 was a record-breaking year. We saw the highest ever levels of greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere, the highest levels of sea level rise, ocean heat, and ocean acidification, to name but a few things. And as Sephora highlighted, a significant part of the climate crisis and broader environmental crisis is driven by fossil fuels. So that's why the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty sees Stockholm+50 as a really major opportunity for engagement. So far, there isn't any global governance mechanism that addresses the issue of fossil fuel production. The Paris Agreement doesn't address it, and it doesn't appear in any other multilateral process. So Stockholm+50 is essentially a really important opportunity to elevate fossil fuels into the multilateral system. And as the Fossil Fuel Treaty Initiative, we have two goals around the Stockholm+50 conference. The first is to try to ensure that there are strong references to fossil fuels in the outcome of Stockholm+50, in the text document that comes out of the conference, to create a hook that we can then use to essentially bring fossil fuels into further UN processes going forward. And then the second is to build momentum and help shift the narrative on fossil fuels using the framing of fossil fuels as weapons of mass destruction to really raise awareness, continue to raise awareness of the threat that they face and how they underpin the climate and environmental crises. So to achieve these goals, we have three major activities that we're embarking on. The first is that the Fossil Fuel Treaty Initiative is holding a flagship pre-summit conference on the global just transition from fossil fuels, which will be in Stockholm on the 1st of June, the day before Stockholm+50. And we're really delighted to be co-hosting this event with the Nordic Council and also with the Stanley Centre for Peace and Security. This event will bring together high-profile speakers along with Indigenous leaders, diplomats, the Stockholm+50 Youth Task Force, and key civil society leaders from around the world. And the idea is that the event will put fossil fuels on the table and then call for environment ministers to work together in managing a global just transition away from fossil fuels, including through supporting a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. We hope to raise the profile of fossil fuels on the day before Stockholm+50 to make sure that this topic makes it onto the agenda of the and basically the idea is, again, to really build momentum around this issue. The report's going to make it clear that for big international processes like Stockholm+50 to be a success, there needs to be big, bold ideas that come out of them to address the top threats that are facing our future. Essentially, we say that Stockholm+50 needs to say the F word and actually put fossil fuels on the agenda and address this issue. The final thing that we've been doing is actually engaging in the official UN process around Stockholm+50 to call on governments directly to address fossil fuels. So over the past few months, UNEP, the UN Environment Programme, along with Sweden and Kenya, who are the host governments of Stockholm+50, have been holding a series of meetings, both working group meetings and preparatory meetings in the lead up to Stockholm, which has engaged governments as well as civil society. And the Fossil Fuel Treaty has been really heavily involved in this process. Unfortunately, despite raising the issue of fossil fuels many times, we have seen a relatively limited willingness to include references to fossil fuels in the documents and reports that have come out of this process so far, which really goes to show why it's so important that we keep pushing, we keep working with civil society and the other colleagues who are on this call today to make sure that these messages continue to be heard. So we'll be present and we'll be engaging in the Stockholm+50 event on the 2nd and the 3rd of June. And we've pulled together a list of demands that the Fossil Fuel Treaty is putting to governments. And these include that countries should acknowledge, recognize, and highlight the risk that fossil fuels present to a healthy planet and prosperity for all. That countries should recognize the urgent need for international cooperation to ensure an equitable phase out of fossil fuels in line with 1.5 degrees and a just transition for fossil fuel dependent countries. The countries should actually commit to phasing out fossil fuel production and also providing support for those countries that need it to be able to transition. We're also calling for countries to establish a global commission on fossil fuels. And this would be a commission that's backed by governments and the UN to produce an authoritative, legitimate evidence base on the impacts of fossil fuels for a healthy and sustainable and inclusive planet that would really form the evidence base for further international cooperation. And finally, we're calling on governments to increase transparency and accountability by reporting their data on fossil fuel production into a global registry of fossil fuels. This is a project that the Treaty Initiative catalyzed, but is now being developed independently by Global Energy Monitor and Carbon Tracker. And it's the first publicly accessible global database on that shows what fossil fuels are being produced and where, and how this translates into carbon dioxide emissions. So Stockholm+50 is an incredibly important opportunity for reflection and stock taking, but for it to be a success, it can't only be looking backwards. Stockholm+50 also needs to result in a clear call for action on fossil fuels that reflects the urgency of the threat that fossil fuels pose. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. Then the report on fossil fuels and the Sustainable Development Goals will be released during Stockholm+50.
Yes, that's right.
Seems like a very important report also in setting the stage in the run-up to COP27. We saw at COP27 some of the early and first discussions of fossil fuels, and for the first time an inclusion of fossil fuels in the text. And so I think this is an important place setter to provide information for COP27 and to encourage that process as well to start to address fossil fuels. I want to turn now to Andreas. Andreas, how does the proposal for a treaty to end fossil fuel production echo the demands of Amazonian indigenous peoples in UN forums?
Muy buenos días, muchas gracias.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for the invitation and greetings to everyone who's following this important space prior to Stockholm+50 and all the debate that has been going on about environment. And of course, after 5 decades, it is important to have reflections as from the organizations and the indigenous peoples, because we have always been contributing and continuously and constantly in the solutions against the climate change. We have had a very firm and strong position in terms of the proliferation of the use of fossil fuels, which has destroyed the Amazon region. This has made a force that for our position to reaffirm always around the non-proliferation treaty of fossil fuels. Now, this proposal has been placed in different international summits for several decades. in the past few years, COICA, look at this, through its structure in the 9 countries, which Ecuador is part of as company, we have had and put forward an agenda of positioning and visualization of our demands and rights. And among these, the opposition to the extraction in the indigenous territories is a position that has been argued and supported in order to protect the huge biodiversity existent in our territories, which is a main contribution to mitigate climate change. But in each one of our countries, well, they're on the contrary, they want to broaden these fossil fuels production. That's why it's so relevant that after 5 decades of the first encounter of environment to address this issue and also to propose a treaty for the non-proliferation of fossil fuels, it is now urgent. And the moment that we are going to have in the framework of Stockholm+50 and the COICA with the structure and the indigenous leadership and the indigenous governance that is going to be represented by the team who's going to be present in this important event. Indeed, they are going to point out several items that we have been pointing out in our press conference. On the one hand, to the need that we can visualize and provide all the strengthening to this proposal and this treaty. Otherwise, the territories are going to keep threatening. In the case of Ecuador, it is urgent, the interest of the government to broaden the extraction through several decrees of extraction, like 91, 95, and 115, which doubles the oil and mining production. And this reality, it's multiplying in each one of our countries. Against that, and in order to place the proposal that we are developing, we have a proposal 80 times 25, that is to preserve up to 25, 80% of the territories of the Panama Zone as an alternative, as a very specific proposal to fight climate change. And as a proposal and as a response as from the indigenous peoples against this problem, but together with the entire civil society and the allies organizations. This is a proposal that we have been working on, which has been supported by the ICN. It was supported in France last year, and this has been also presented in international conferences like COP26, which has been socialized and presented in several international events of incidents. Is going to be presented as the agreement of biological biodiversity. And also Stockholm+50 is one of the proposals that we are trying to reach us from the indigenous peoples, and that COICA is like a flag there. And this is not only discourse, speech, it has very specific proposals. One of them that is quite well articulated to the context that we are talking about, the non-proliferation of fossil fuels, is the strategy of incidence with European banks and North American banks and also Asian banks about the need, the necessity of these financial institutions, which somehow have been accomplished by financing crude oil trading, and to stop financing this trading and to adopt environmental and environmentally friendly policies as their own institutes stipulate in terms of environment, which unfortunately in the past few years have not been complied with. But in that regard, we have very important progress and advances. We have had like 7 banks, and the last bank, which is the BNP Paribas, that just announced the decision, which to us is historical, as from this moment to stop financing the crude oil trading, which has as an expression the source of extraction is indigenous people's territory. Therefore, this treaty is to have this strategy of incidence with the first instance banks and which are the European banks. 6 of them announced this commitment, which became official, to stop financing this extraction or the burden of extraction. And BNP Paribas has one who has joined us, and we hope that this awareness also extends. Just like governments are trying to broaden this extraction of fossil fuels, we want to proliferate the environmental awareness, and that all financial institutions should be committed, and that have been committed with this industry, just to follow the example of different financial institutions that they are adopting. Once this increase and the threat is going to lessen in our territories, and the world of biodiversity is going to take a deep breath, and therefore we're going to be ensuring a planetary equilibrium balance that we are right now. So the transition into a situation that allows us to visualize a survival for human beings. Otherwise, if we do not adopt a series of treaties, if we continue with the proliferation policy of production of fossil fuels, then the world is going to be condemned to extinction. And among them, indigenous peoples and the communities settled in those territories, and we are the first ones to feel those impacts. Therefore, we would like to make a call in the agenda of incidents that we are, or advocacy that we are going to keep going in different international events, and here in Stockholm+50 and the forthcoming events. And we're going to be participating with our proposals, not only with our strong position, but proposals and alternatives that I have pointed out and that we invite for Stockholm+50, that we can have the space of exchange, of dialogue, and to share all those experiences, not only as a contribution for and from the indigenous peoples, but as a contribution and proposal from the indigenous peoples towards all humanity. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andreas, and congratulations on the success of the 80 by 25 proposal at the IUCN, and also the recent announcement by BNP Paribas in moving finance out of oil drilling in the Amazon. I understand that is billions of dollars, and the leadership by Koika and the success of your initiatives gives us hope. I've put links in the chat for anyone who wants more information on the 80 by 25 proposal, as well as the Exit Amazon Oil and Gas Finance Initiative that Andreas referred to. Simon, I want to turn to you now. Could you explain to us why the Nordic Council is co-hosting the pre-summit on fossil fuels with the Treaty Initiative?
Thank you so much for asking. For us in the Nordic region, climate issues are on the agenda all the time, and it has been for many years. Many consider the Nordic countries to be frontrunners in the green transition. They point out the hydropower in especially Sweden, the Danish technology for wind energy, Icelandic innovations for geothermal energy, and the Finnish forest industry, bringing about new biofuels. Moreover, the market for electric cars is skyrocketing here, and it's also the development of technology when it comes to energy issues is, of course, continuously increasing. For instance, fossil-free steel production in Sweden. I would agree. We should be proud of how far we have come. We should also be proud of the fact that the Nordic countries now have climate laws and climate policy frameworks with long-term goals in place. We realize, however, that national efforts are not enough. If we would put together all the 5 countries' economies, we would become as large as Russia. So the potential we harbor together to do a just transition is large. The Nordic governments collaborate in an institution called the Nordic Council of Ministers, which is the so-called Nordic government. In 2019, they adopted a new vision that the Nordic region should be the most sustainable and integrated region in the world. The same year, the Nordic Prime Minister signed a declaration on carbon. And since then, the Nordic community has become more active within international advocacy for climate issues, such as the COPs. But you know, despite the efforts, emissions are not dropping as fast as they should. Our carbon footprint is still far off the planetary boundaries, higher than many countries in the world, perhaps even most countries. And we still produce a lot of fossil fuels here as well, which we know kill the planet. So we are losing the war against climate change. And as you know, if a government doesn't do enough, then it's the parliament's task to hold it accountable. You can say that the Nordic Council is the Nordic Parliament, composed of representatives of all the parliaments from the countries and autonomous regions, myself being from the autonomous region of Åland. During recent years, we have put more pressure on ministers and governments to take bolder action and discussed many more radical proposals in our sessions. One example was the proposal to set an end date on the use of fossil fuels. Another one to decide when to stop all searching and drilling for fossil fuels. Of course, party groups of the Nordic Council differ in what measures are best in achieving a just transition, because the question is not only about doing a transition from a set of energy supplies into others, it's also about ensuring that nobody is left behind when this transition is being done. And this is especially a matter for us in the Nordic region, as we are indeed one of the wealthier parts of the world. For instance, we have we're very much discussed how to build people support in this transition, the inclusion of youth and indigenous people in decision-making processes, how not to leave disadvantaged groups behind, and whether ambitious targets here in the global north might lead to outsourcing of carbon-intensive operations in the global south. So yeah, what we do have in common, however, across political parties, is that we want to contribute to the global dialogue and take the role to facilitate such dialogue on these very, very much important issues, because we cannot do it on our own. And international, as we know, international cooperation is key. This is why we're co-hosting this pre-summit on global just transition from fossil fuels. We find it utterly important now more than ever to bring decision makers, experts, and leaders of society together from all around the globe to focus on the matters that are crucial for a common future. Which moments in time is not better to hold such a pre-summit, if not in the lead up to the UN meeting Stockholm+50, marking the beginning, as we hope, of a new era in global cooperation around sustainability issues. We hope that the outcomes of the pre-summit will offer meaningful guidance and support to the Stockholm+50 delegates, not only the Nordic ones. And well, on behalf of the Nordic Council, I welcome you all to the perhaps one of the most interesting pre-summits within the Stockholm+50 umbrella. Welcome to the Nordic region. Welcome to Stockholm, the 1st of June. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It is going to be an exciting, I think, day and an important conversation in the run-up both to Stockholm and then future summits. Magdalene, finally, I want to turn to you before we open it up for questions. And if people have questions, there is a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Please feel free to type in your questions and we'll take them shortly. Magdalene, how does the treaty initiative strengthen your fieldwork in Nigeria? And why do you think building momentum for a fossil fuel treaty is important before COP27?
Thank you, Sephora. As we all know, fossil fuel is one of the, I would say, is the greatest contributor to climatic issues, especially in Nigeria. Most of the problems we have is caused by oil exploration, especially in the Niger Delta region, where you see people, where you see oil spillage on the land. You see biodiversity lost, people not having potable drinking water. We have so many issues. They can't even go to their farms anymore because the farms don't yield anything, and the fishermen cannot even be able to fish because the fishes are not there. And we have even loss of jobs. We have community crisis arising from this, because you most at times you see communities fighting for lands that hold these oils, because basically Nigeria depends on oil exploration. Though we have other mineral resources, we are not depending on them. We don't explore that option. Most people, or I would say the government, is mainly concentrating on oil exploration, causing harm to the ordinary Nigerians. Even if you go to where all these oils are explored, you see suffering in the lives of people. They are really living in abject poverty, and nobody is doing anything. Even though over the years, people have been fighting about this individually, but nothing has changed. Rather, the government is more determined in expanding the production and putting subsidies on fossil fuel, which is not helping matters at all. And the youth are just wasting away, no jobs, nothing to do. And you see that there's an increase in crime rates in the country. Just like some few weeks ago, we lost over almost 200 lives in illegal refineries. There was an explosion there and lives were lost. And it's just like nothing happened. Everybody, right now, nobody is talking about it. Just few weeks, I think 2 weeks ago, and it's like nothing happened. And we have some communities around Cross River fighting with themselves because of oil wells. So when you look at it, we have done our best as individuals, we have done our best as NGOs, and nothing is changing. So this COP27, I see it as an opportunity for us to air our views to the wider society, because it's a stage, it's a bigger stage for us to present our problems, being it a climate change conference. I believe it's the right place for us to present our issues and see how these things will be remedied. The issue of loss and compensation is not even happening. People, even though sometimes the oil companies will attempt to compensate the owners of the land, the indigenous people, those compensation does not reach the ordinary people. It's always the case of being diverted and all that. So we feel that COP27 as well as Stockholm+50, it's a big stage for all this to be remedied. If the production and the exploration of oil is reduced, then I believe that most of these problems will be tackled. And on the part of the youth, we feel that being in the task force, it's a great opportunity for me and my colleague to be able to air our view, because here in the country, I don't think the voices of the youth are being heard. So we being in the task force, we had the opportunity of contributing our quota to the policy paper, where we penned our demand on the reduction and the phasing of fossil fuel. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Magdalene, and your comments really echo the need for a global just transition. It's interesting, we hear a lot of calls and talk about just transition at a national level, but I think what we've heard today, both about the situation in Nigeria and also Andreas in the Amazon, is points towards the need for a global just transition. That's going to mean cooperation between countries, both bilateral as well as multilateral cooperation, what our research at the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative is showing is that there are a number of countries who are pursuing greater production of oil or gas just to feed their debt. And if we're going to ensure economic diversification and support for those countries, especially emerging economies, to slow down or even leap over the fossil fuel era in order to move now to safer and cleaner energy systems, there's going to need to be new agreements in international support to address stopping the expansion of production of oil and gas. I'm devastated to hear about the explosion in the refinery. Especially, I understand after in February there was another explosion of a vessel, just off the oil vessel, just off the coast of Nigeria, and our hearts go out to the families of those lost.
Thank you.
Rebecca, I want to turn back to you for a moment. We have a question, and again, if you'd like to put your questions, some people are putting them directly in the chat to me. You can put them also in the Q&A button if those who are watching have questions. Rebecca, you're currently right now at the Sea4All Summit in Rwanda. Can you tell us a bit more about how the fossil fuel industry is pushing for more production in the African region, especially gas, and what we should be ready for at COP27 in Egypt, framed now as the African COP?
Thanks, Sephora. Yes, it's a real challenge. I think there are a couple of things that are sort of pushing the fossil fuel industry into, I suppose, seeing Africa as an opportunity for increased expansion. The first is, of course, the Ukraine war and crisis, and the increased demand from Europe for gas and oil that doesn't come from Russia. And while, of course, there's a lag in terms of scaling up renewable energy, we know that it is possible to do that incredibly quickly and to meet energy needs through renewables. However, there is quite a risk and kind of a trend at the moment of European nations entering into bilateral trade agreements with countries in Africa for short-term increased supply of gas to supply European countries, which may have short-term economic benefits here on the continent, but really risks long-term stranded assets and massive debt. I think there's a real fear that essentially these new developments might lock countries into infrastructure that has a lifetime of several decades, but perhaps is only needed by Europe for half a decade, and then results in a stranded asset and huge financial consequences for countries here on the continent. There's also been a discussion around, of course, the need for African countries to meet their energy demand. And it's a completely justified and valuable conversation, and whether or not that might happen through gas as a transition fuel. I think, again, it raises the risk of stranded assets down the track. I think it's a really challenging conversation, though, because there are hundreds of millions of people on this continent and around 800 million people around the world that still don't have access to energy. And that's a genuine need that we need to meet as soon as we can. I think where the Fossil Fuel Treaty comes in is it thinks about how to create a mechanism at the international level that supports the transition away from fossil fuels to 100% renewable energy access for everyone, including those that currently don't have access via renewables. We did a report last year which shows that it's more than possible to meet the energy demand of every single person in the world via renewables. And in fact, Africa has the most renewable capacity of any continent. It's quite amazing. And but there is a need for support to make that happen and happen at the speed needed to meet the needs of people and to prevent further lock into potentially economically devastating fossil fuel production. So it's a really tricky conversation, but I think the reason why the treaty is quite exciting is because it helps provide a mechanism for that transition. So and the support that's needed to move towards renewables instead.
Thank you. Moving back to the Amazon, Andreas, you mentioned that there has been some progress in the Amazon region, especially with the campaign that Koika has embarked on the finance initiative with Stand.Earth and Amazon Watch. But I understand there are still new drilling plans especially in Ecuador, for new oil drilling, and also that both the indigenous leadership has been noting, and the science, Western science has confirmed that when new roads are put in, that they provide access to the fires, and that is then a kind of double threat. Can you speak to those upcoming threats and the new oil concessions that have been planned in the Amazon? Do we still have Andreas with us? Okay, we may have a communications issue. So I'm going to move then, we'll hold that question till when we have Andreas back on the line. And I'm going to move then to, oh, Andreas, can you hear us now? No, I'm going to move to Simon then while we wait. So Simon.
Sí, sí, les escucho.
Okay, Andreas, you're there.
Yes.
Great. Did you hear the question?
Perdón, no, es que se cortó un ratito y no alcancé a escuchar.
Sorry, I couldn't hear because it was breaking up. Could you please repeat the question?
Sure. So Andreas, you mentioned that there is some progress that has happened in the Amazon, in large part because of your campaign with others from Koika and Stand.Earth and Amazon Watch on the finance. But I understand that there is also new oil drilling plans in the region, especially in Ecuador, and that there's also evidence from indigenous leadership and confirmed by Western science that these new roads provide an access point for fires and dramatically increase the potential for fires in the Amazon, providing this kind of double threat. Can you tell us a little bit more about the new plans, extraction plans in the Amazon that you're facing?
Sí, sin duda, y gracias por la pregunta.
Yes, without a doubt. Thank you for the question. Well, in the Amazon region, the last context that we are living, we're talking about a triple emergency. We call it triple pandemic because on the one hand, we have the sanitary emergency that shaken the world, and the Amazon region has been also strong. But what this did was to unfold another historical vulnerability, which is the condition of marginalization of the communities that are settled in those territories. That's the second emergency. But in addition, the pandemic also stressed on the destructive pandemic. This is the proliferation of bidding and tenders to oil companies, mining companies, in which the communities, we were in lockdown and we were fighting against COVID-19, and which it did was to reaffirm the extractive policy of the government that has proposed that in order to come out from the sanitary emergency, we have to report to the extraction of oil, and it's going to be the way to go out and to succeed as a country. And this goes against the fight of communities who have been firm in the position of not extending this extraction. Here we are mentioning 3 types of pandemics that we're going through at the same time, and that of course have impacted, and they keep impacting us significantly. On the one hand, the plans of the governments through 2 decrees 95 that seeks to double the oil extraction to 1 million barrels per day, and decree 151 that seeks to strengthen the policy of extraction of mining in open air by mining concessions in the central and south of Ecuador, as well as timber and hydroelectric power concessions. These are also more threats. So this is the triple emergency that is shaking us and that is affecting, and within the government plans, they are not taking into account the situation of vulnerability, of marginalization and poverty, and the historical marginalization that we have had from the communities, and they are not taking into account the data throughout that the sanitary emergency was not distraction that got out of the crisis, took out of the crisis the country, but to recourse to agriculture to feed the population during these sanitary emergencies. So the government plans only responded to private and particular interests, whether state or private interests or the company. Another reality of the communities and indigenous peoples, where we have the devastation, as we have seen in several cases, which are very sad, of mining production that has also caused deaths and several social conflicts and destruction and environmental destruction. That's why we emphasize to have oil underground and to read our initiatives and to have life plans, to have initiatives of conservation of the territories, all these that are articulated around the proposal of COICA 80 times 25. And for all the governments to have this awareness, and also the banks, because without the financing of the banks, that these companies cannot move forward. But because of financing of the banks, that's how this has been multiplied, and the extraction of oil is a possibility for them. That's why we have to make a call for all banks to raise awareness and to follow the example of the different banks. After seeing this reality, even if they didn't know this, now they know, and they cannot finance these to give states like California or other type of states, and to record the indigenous territories like the National Park in Yasuni, which is things that which endangers the indigenous peoples. These are the realities that we are going through, and that as leaders, we are trying just to raise awareness and to put forward so that all the world can know them.
Thank you, Andres. It just seems almost incomprehensible that it's so clear now, the science is showing that Amazon is so critical for global stability of climate and biodiversity, and yet this month we saw the science come out that deforestation of the Amazon has hit a record high this year. You know, on the heels of the Glasgow Forest Declaration and all of these announcements about how we have to protect what's left of the world's primary forests and how critical the Amazon is, it seems particularly horrific that there's these new extraction plans in the heart of the Amazon, and I certainly are thankful that so many indigenous leaders from COICA and others are coming to Stockholm+50 as well as COP27 to raise these alarm bells, but not just raise the alarm bells, but put forward a vision for protection and encompassed in 80 by 25. That's really important and really exciting, and hopefully that can be lifted up during the Stockholm+50 conversation. If we as a world, 50 years after Stockholm, can't even come together to agree to protect what's left of the most important forest on earth, it would be hard pressed. We would be hard pressed to say that Stockholm+50 was a success without that protection. Simon, I want to move to you as a member of the Nordic Council. Can you tell us a bit more about what you think should be the role of rich producing countries like Norway? Of course, recently we've heard that there is new oil drilling also planned off the coast in Norway. And of course, Equinor, a majority state-held company, is now proposing a massive new drilling project, Bay du Nord, off the east coast of Canada as well. Can you comment on the role of rich producing countries like Norway in the Nordic Council?
Thank you for the question. I think there's many aspects to that. First, the world is looking at us when it comes to, you know, our progressive Nordic welfare model with the security nets, you know, encapsulating all people. Really, we shouldn't leave anyone behind, and that's also the kind of message when we go into these discussions of phasing out fossil fuel, both the usage and the production side. The problem, though, is in our Nordic society that it is financed by unsustainable operations, and you know, with Norway, the case of fossil fuels also being a great, you know, a great source of taxation, really. And that is, of course, an issue. Last year, researchers published in Nature mapped out, the amounts of explored fossil fuels globally. They found that about 55%, I think, of all resources cannot be extracted in order to reach the Paris Agreement 1.5 degree target. And of course, Norway is doing quite much now also, in response to the war in Ukraine, to expand its fossil production. It has spurred a heated discussion in the Nordic Council, whether that is in line with the ministerial declaration from 2019 on Nordic climate neutrality. So in response to the actions of Norway, there are new proposals on the table for the next session coming from the Center Group, which I'm a part of, saying that or recommending the Nordic countries to become part of the BOGA, the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance. And that is a very diplomatic way of saying that Norway should stop. Let's see about that. It's going to be a very, very interesting autumn, I would say, in the Nordic Council, because now we really have to decide what future we want to have.
Thank you. Yes, and for those who aren't familiar, the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance, BOGA, was formed COP26, chaired by Denmark and Costa Rica, and I believe there are now 11 countries and subnationals that have joined the group to collaborate on stopping the expansion of oil and gas and managing a global wind down. It's an important initiative, and we think one of the key first steps globally towards a fossil fuel treaty. We have time, I think, just for one more quick question. I see that has been answered in the chat, but I'm going to ask you, Rebecca, if you can elaborate a little bit. We had a question from Christian regarding the equitable phase down and phase out of countries having fossil fuels as top export category. For example, the next two hosts of the UNFCCC COPs. What will be the value proposition for these two countries? And considering these circumstances, shouldn't the treaty already start right now in Sweden around Stockholm+50 and even be signed before Sharm el-Sheikh due to the climate emergency we're in?
Thanks, Sephora, and thanks for the question. I guess there are two parts. The first is the value proposition for countries that are really dependent on fossil fuels. So Egypt and the United Arab Emirates are both fossil fuel producing countries that rely on revenue from this industry to be able to provide government services to citizens. And that's a huge challenge. And the value proposition of the treaty is that it aims to help countries that are dependent on fossil fuels, and Nigeria is another example that we've heard about today, to start to think about economic diversification. What are other things that the economy can move towards that doesn't mean that people in the economy are dependent on revenue from fossil fuels for basic services? Because ultimately this transition is happening, and there are many countries that are going to be sort of dealing with stranded assets and dealing with lost revenue. And if they don't plan for that, it's quite scary to think of the development consequences of that transition. And so that's a really big part of our work at the Fossil Fuel Treaty, is how do we set up a mechanism via international cooperation that helps facilitate that diversification and finding new opportunities for development. And it would be amazing if we could negotiate and sign a treaty before Sharm el-Sheikh. These things do take time, but we have a really clear pathway of how we want to start with Stockholm+50 as a first milestone in the multilateral space, putting fossil fuels onto the agenda, and then use that as a hook for the UN General Assembly, then COP27, and then future meetings of countries to really coalesce, hopefully very quickly, around the idea of a fossil fuel treaty. And every step on that journey has value in raising the issue, putting pressure on governments to then take domestic action as well. So we're working to get a treaty as quickly as we can, but Sephora often makes this great point, I think, which is that the journey matters as well. And every step on that way, and every time we're building momentum and putting pressure on governments and creating new hooks in the international system, we're also having an impact on the national political environment and getting us closer to that point as well. So it's not just the action will start once we have the treaty, it can also happen on the way there, which I think is quite exciting. And hopefully Stockholm+50 is a key milestone on that journey in getting us there.
It's a really important question. And in order to be able to move quickly at Stockholm+50 and at COP27 to stop the expansion of fossil fuels and plan for a global wind down, it's going to require elected officials to step up and to have the courage to be leaders. The fact is there is enormous pressure from the fossil fuel industry, not only to not stop expansion, but to continue expansion under the guise of the need for energy security and the war. But we know that our ecological as well as energy and economic security is in fact better served by cleaner and safer renewable systems that address the climate emergency. And that's part of why we're having this conversation today and having the conversation as well at Stockholm+50. I want to thank you all so much for joining us this morning and sharing your perspectives in the run-up to Stockholm+50. We'll be following your work and sure to amplify it through the channels of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative so people can follow what's happening in all of your countries and in the international initiative. Thank you to everyone for attending this briefing ahead of what we hope is a productive anniversary to the first International UN Summit on the Environment. Again, we will be hosting an official pre-summit event on the global just transition from fossil fuels on June 1st. Our team will be sharing a link to that in the chat now. It is a full day of panels that will be live streamed with dozens of speakers from around the world, including representatives of indigenous nations, governments, international institutions, civil society, academic experts, faith organizations, and others in the diplomatic arena. Before we go, I'd also like to draw your attention to the Parliamentarians' Initiative for a Fossil-Free Future, a compatible initiative to the Fossil Fuel Treaty where parliamentarians from around the world are endorsing the pillars of similar pillars to the treaty and calling for international cooperation to stop the expansion of fossil fuels. We hope to see nation states stepping forward this year to commit to end the expansion of fossil fuels, to join BOGA, to endorse the Fossil Fuel Treaty. And it starts by cities and individual parliamentarians being willing to step forward and put their names forward. So please take a look out for Parliamentarians for a Fossil-Free Future. As well as always, if you'd like to learn more about our initiative, please visit fossilfueltreaty.org. Thank you so much for joining us this morning, and we'll see you from Stockholm.